Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the November 9th, Season 4, Episode 2 of Ask Us. I'm Jean Smart, the host of Ask Us, and I would like to start off by acknowledging that our broadcast extends across many Indigenous lands and territories throughout British Columbia. We acknowledge with respect and humility that our Vancouver offices are located on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And here's a beautiful graphic from our communications department showing some of the beautiful symbols and the lands in the background. Our guest producer today is Nan Doe from Health Research BC Communications. Hi, Nan.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today.
He works very hard behind the scenes to bring this to you. Today's Ask Us format is a special guest presentation and an expert interview, followed with a question period. And our topic today is on clinical trials for cannabis in Canada. Our Ask Us question is, what is the current clinical trials landscape for cannabis in Canada? So there's a growing interest in the therapeutic potential of cannabis products for treatment of various health and mental health concerns, with a slowly increasing number of cannabis trials underway to evaluate the safety, the effectiveness of this particular product. Today, we're having a presentation from a guest speaker who will enlighten our insight on this emerging field with clinical trials. And we're going to become a little bit more familiar with the landscape by means of nomenclature, glossary, current ideas of trials, safety considerations, potential risks and benefits, the licensing and the evolving regulations during all covered during this broadcast. So I'd love to introduce you to our guest today. We often get our topics from the suggestion box. Or from emerging trends in clinical trials. However, this time the topic and guest sat down right beside me. I met our guest at the 2022 Clinical Trials BC hosted event on investigator training. And there beside me was a new investigator. This should be a warning to you that if you actually sit beside me at the upcoming Clinical Trial BC Symposium, you could end up on our Ask Us show. So our guest and I launched into a fascinating conversation about clinical trials in cannabis and the changing regulatory environment. And over lunch, it was more on the complex pathways and the benefits and the operational surprises. So after our chat, I thought we must have her on the show here, and so that I can share my learning experience from her with you. And our guest today is Neuroscience PhD student in the Behavioral Reward Effect and Impulsivity Brain Lab, and a Matrix Junior Scholar at the University of British Columbia. Her current research interests include interactions between stress regulation, substance use, and mental health disorders. And she's also conducting clinical trial examining the effects of cannabis using magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, and is involved in a study emerging on examining changes in acute stress response in people receiving treatment for concurrent mental health and substance use disorders. Our accomplished guest also holds a baccalaureate degree in psychology, a Bachelor of Education, and a teaching license. She's incredibly organized and is enthusiastic about the topic of cannabis clinical trials. Please give a very warm welcome to our guest today, Karina Thiessen. Hi, Karina.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on here. I'm really excited. And yeah, it's been almost a year, I guess, or pretty much since we met. So yeah, really happy to kind of have this moment a year later.
I'm glad you're here. Before we get started with your prepared presentation, I wanted the viewers to get to know you just a little bit and the context of your presentation this afternoon. So I have a first question. Can you tell us just a little bit about what inspired you to become involved in clinical trials related to cannabis?
Yeah, for sure. So I actually kind of just fell into it. An opportunity came up to kind of be involved with a cannabis clinical trial, and I took that opportunity. And then the more I dug into it, the more I realized that it's an incredibly nuanced topic, and there's a lot of debates and narratives going around it. And so I'm really interested in mental health and substance use kind of in general and the interactions between the two, and with cannabis use being so common and with there being so many narratives around its effects and things like that. I think it's a really important research area so that, Canadians can be informed consumers of it, especially as a lot of countries are kind of looking to Canada as a case study with legalization.
Seems like it. And I think we all fall into things, but I think you fell into a good thing, and we certainly appreciate your work. Okay, so before we get started on your presentation, I have another question. Can you just give us a little preview on what the presentations, what the content and scope is?
Yeah, for sure. I'll try not to give too much away. But cannabis research has been affected by a lot of different changes in regulations, both kind of in general and also in the research context. And so, we really have a need to test a lot of those claims about the effects of cannabis through high quality research, including clinical trials in both the therapeutic and the non-therapeutic context. And so I want to kind of cover some of those changes in regulations around cannabis use and research on cannabis, how the definitions of even clinical trials with cannabis has kind of changed over the years and what that means for research today and in the future. And so I mentioned therapeutic and non-therapeutic cannabis research. And so for the purpose of this presentation, a clinical trial is a study where we're trying to examine the therapeutic effects of a drug. So looking to treat a medical disease or a condition. And so, yeah.
Okay, so that helps set the stage for us. So we know we're talking about therapeutics. Okay. Thank you so much to all of you who are viewing for sending in your questions ahead of time. We found it very appreciative, and it sort of guided a lot of the presentation. So Karina has prepared a lovely presentation for us, addressing most of your questions. And of course, I've saved a few for the end. So Karina, take it away.
All right. Good. I will just get my screen set up here.
Perfect.
All right, there we go. Yeah, so as being kindly introduced me, as my name is Karina, I'm a PhD neuroscience student with the Brain Lab. And in our lab, we focus predominantly on substance use and addictions and concurrent mental health and substance use disorders. So we do quite a wide range of work, including kind of characterization, mechanistic studies in clinical populations, including at treatment centers, as well as we have some sponsor and investigator-initiated clinical trials going in. And so my focus is primarily in translational research using neuroimaging, but I'm also really interested in treatment development for mental health and substance use disorders. So we know that 1 in 3 Canadians are going to experience a mental health disorder in their lifetime, and there's a huge unmet need for research and treatment in this area. I do want to start off as well by also acknowledging that I'm currently on Musqueam territory, and as a settler, it's my responsibility to actively take steps towards reconciliation. And we are talking about cannabis, which is a plant that has been used by Indigenous populations for centuries and centuries. And so I also want to recognize the history behind that as well. A few disclosures. I just want to give a little bit of a shout out to Clinical Trials BC and to CanTrain for its supporting clinical trials training for graduate students like myself, as well as postdoctoral fellows and things like that. So if that's something that you're interested in, I really encourage you to look at the CanTrain website, actually. So I'm going to talk today a bit about the history and current day cannabis use, what are actually cannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system, why do we want to study cannabis, and of course, what's the regulatory context and the state of research today, as well as hopefully provide you with a few helpful resources if this is an area that you're interested in. So cannabis as a plant is actually indigenous to Central and Southeast Asia and has been traced back to 12,000 years ago, where there's actually selective breeding for kind of the marijuana strain that has this kind of high inducing effect, as well as hemp, which has been used primarily for like fibers and oils and things like that. And throughout the centuries, there have been many, many written accounts of medical uses. And I mentioned as well over here, there have been signs of use for a couple of millennia by Indigenous peoples. And in current day, about 50% of Canadians, I believe over the age of 16, have used cannabis at least once in their lifetime, and about 20% have used in the past year. What's the history of the regulations around cannabis? So I've highlighted here, we have in a lighter kind of blue color, kind of the global regulations or kind of some noteworthy events globally, and then the darker blue are Canada specific events. So in the 1800s, it was somewhat recognized as kind of a medical substance. But then in 1923, it became illegal under the Canadian Narcotics Drug Act Amendment. And Canada was actually one of the first countries to make cannabis illegal, which is kind of interesting because we also then became one of the first countries to make it legal. And then a couple years later, in 1925, it was included in the International Opium Convention. They had kind of a list going on there, and it became restricted in many countries following that. So fast forward 75 years later, the Canadian courts deemed medical cannabis acts as a constitutional right. So this was actually a court decision. And then in 2013, Uruguay became the first country to legalize recreational cannabis, with Canada following 5 years later with the Cannabis Act. And then in 2019, the World Health Organization has recommended rescheduling cannabis in international treaties. And so one of the questions that actually came up with the legalization of cannabis in Canada is, how is that going to work with all of these international treaties around cannabis? So what actually is the substance that we're talking about? Cannabis is a plant species with multiple strains, including, as I mentioned, hemp and marijuana. And in 1964, the chemical structure of THC was discovered, which then kind of led to a whole bunch of research around cannabis. And since 1964, over 100 phytocannabinoids, which are these chemical compounds found within the cannabis plant, have been discovered and identified, including THC, CBD, CBG, CBN, and so on. And the discovery of cannabis led to the discovery of the endocannabinoid system. So the endocannabinoid system is a neurotransmitter, neuroreceptor system that's relatively spread out throughout our bodies, but primarily in our central nervous system, as well as some peripheral tissues. And so it has a lot of potential effects on emotion, pain, inflammation, appetite, learning, neuroplasticity, neurodevelopment, and so forth. So cannabis is acting on this internal kind of intrinsic system within our body. Why study it? So there's a lot of untested or misleading claims out there. There's also a lot of potential for cannabis as a treatment for things, but there's a lot of kind of narratives I've mentioned going around about cannabis. This is just an image I found online. And some of these claims are fairly exaggerated. Cannabis is also a substance that's widely available to the general population and in many, many forms, right? So if something is widely available and there's a lot of claims about the effects, we want to make sure that people are consuming cannabis for and it is having the effects that they actually believe it's having, if that makes sense. So why study it? Cannabis has many compounds that we don't really understand very well yet. Many report using cannabis for medical purposes, and all of this has really significant public health implications, which could be potentially positive or negative depending on the context, right? So driving under the influence or cannabis as a potential pain treatment, the implications of vaping or smoking for lung health. It could potentially be used as a anti-nauseant for chemotherapy-induced nausea, and it may have impacts on mental health as a potential treatment, or it may have some harmful effects, right? So there's a lot of questions about what cannabis might be doing, right? And there's a high need for research to clarify a lot of these effects. So how did legalization impact research in Canada? With the 2018 legalization, there was a lot of excitement about what legalization meant for research. And there was a lot of ideas about, oh, this is a perfect opportunity to kind of extend and grow our research in this area. And Canada had this aim actually of becoming a world leader in cannabis research. And so in 2019, for example, there was a report from the Mental Health Commission of Canada that said that legalization was a very great opportunity for Canada to become a leader in cannabis research. But then what kind of happened is, yes, recreational cannabis was legalized, which made it easier for the average user to access. But so I've been told research pre-legalization, according to some people, was actually easier. And why is that? So Canada basically said, yes, cannabis is legalized, but any research still has to follow the clinical trials framework. And there was a lot of backlash from researchers and from industry. Our own lab, we had to pivot our own cannabis treatment study and experience multi-year delays because of that. I know some people have faced like 5-year delays in the research because of this clinical trials requirement. And so notice here I have a screenshot of a whole bunch of clarifications on cannabis research regulations. And so because of this kind of backlash and these discussions and through consultations with researchers and with industry, the government has made some kind of amendments to the regulations. Yeah, so they actually released like 3 different guidance documents in the past few years about it. And so in 2021, there's kind of this dual framework or dual system of cannabis research where Health Canada said all human cannabis administration studies are considered a clinical trial, but they can be therapeutic or non-therapeutic. So what do I mean by that? A non-therapeutic study is still a clinical trial, but when filing for a clinical trial application to be able to run a clinical trial, we don't have to provide product-specific safety data. So we have to provide a whole bunch of information about what any drug does to the body when applying for a clinical trial approval or application from the government. But in the case of cannabis, if it's a non-therapeutic study, then we can just kind of talk about cannabis or THC or CBD in general. And so a non-therapeutic study could include evaluating like the taste or the smell of a cannabis product or some kind of physiological or psychological effects that don't have to do with any kind of intended treatment or therapeutic effects. And then a therapeutic clinical trial still have to follow all the normal clinical trial regulations. So product-specific safety data sent to the government and so forth. So even after that, there was still some backlash or still a lot of debate around what the actual policy should be around cannabis research in Canada. So this was an article published in 2021 that described clinical cannabis research as being in purgatory. And so, and part of the reason for that was because of this kind of regulatory situation going on. And so then in 2022, the Health Canada held quite a number of consultations that were open to the public to think about how they could adapt the regulations. And so then they came up with what is the current framework. So there is still this therapeutic versus non-therapeutic division for cannabis research. And therapeutic studies are still considered clinical trials. It requires all the same approvals that it used to require. So for example, getting Health Canada approval, following our international good clinical practice standards, and getting pharmaceutical grade cannabis. Then they have this other track, which I mentioned earlier, but is now a little bit different. Non-therapeutic cannabis research, or NTRC, non-therapeutic research on cannabis is like the official acronym for that. And they are no longer considered clinical trials, but they do still need to go through a licensing system. And so it doesn't have to get Health Canada approval, but we still need federal approval through what's called CTLS. So therapeutic, Health Canada and CTLS, non-therapeutic is just CTLS. And this is regulated by the Cannabis Act. And then the cannabis product itself does not need to be pharmaceutical grade. meet the Canadian manufacturing standards for cannabis. And so we have this kind of dual system here. I've just kind of included, you probably can't even read this, but this is just kind of a flow chart of the complexity of decision-making with determining what kind of approvals you need to be able to conduct cannabis research. I also mentioned, I'm just going to go back, for non-therapeutic studies, there are 3 risk categories that depend on a number of different things, like the population that you're studying, the cannabis dose, route of administration, and so on, and the level of information that you're having to provide when applying to the CTLS kind of system for a cannabis research license. And the level of information that you have to provide varies by the risk category. And so that I've just kind of included a screenshot. Again, you probably can't read that, but just to kind of demonstrate, you'll see there's category 1, 2, and 3 there. So why bother having 2 classes of cannabis research? Cannabis use itself in a way kind of has 2 classes, right? We have medical use and non-medical use. That line is a bit blurry, right? Where people aren't necessarily getting prescriptions. They're kind of like deciding, oh, I think cannabis will work for this, or I heard it, and they maybe are self-medicating, right? But in theory, we kind of have medical purposes and then recreational purposes, right? So this kind of framework of clinical trials and then non-therapeutic cannabis research is kind of trying, I think, to follow those 2 streams. And we do need cannabis research for therapeutic reasons to be held to the higher standard of clinical trials and for pharmaceutical research, because we need to protect the rights, health, and safety of patients, right? So when we're examining cannabis use as a potential therapeutic, we're working with vulnerable populations. The dosing that might be provided to patients may be different from typical recreational use or just kind of general population use. So a lot of clinical trials, for example, are administering high doses of CBD, like 400 milligrams of CBD. That's not necessarily typical use. There is also potential risk for harm. So for example, there could be interactions with different medical conditions and medications. So we want to evaluate any kind of medication systematically. And we also want to make sure that there aren't any false claims in cannabis marketing, right? So I think, because cannabis is so widely available, there can be a lot of claims about it. And, sometimes there's this, people take information maybe and run with it and kind of generalize in situations where information shouldn't be generalized. So if cannabis is maybe indicated for one particular disease or disorder, right, it doesn't mean that it will work in another context, right? So we want to make sure that people are understanding what the evidence is. And medication safety and efficacy is context dependent, basically, in summary. So, who is taking it, what drug, how much, how often, and when. And we all want to evaluate all of that through this framework of a clinical trial, as opposed to a non-therapeutic study. So currently in Canada, there's actually only 2 currently approved cannabis medications that I'm aware of. And so we have Sativex, which is for MS-related muscle spasms. And we also have a Nabilone, which is synthetic, kind of mimicking THC, that's used as an anti-nauseant for cancer chemotherapy treatment. And the nausea that can be induced by that. So those are actually only the 2 medications that we have approved in Canada for therapeutic reasons. And then I just did like a quick look at clinicaltrials.gov, which is it's actually a US-based database of ongoing and completed clinical trials. Canada does not have its own registration kind of standard kind of registration system for clinical trials. So a lot of researchers end up registering on the US system. And so these may not be all the clinical trials happening in Canada, but of the phase 3 trials in Canada that are registered on this website, we have 10, and some have terminated, some are complete, and some are actively recruiting, which to me, this doesn't feel like a very high number for a phase 3 trial for something that is so widely available, especially given all of the claims about it. But this is kind of the current state of things. So We see some studies looking at pain, epilepsy, some mental health and substance use disorders as well, but fairly narrow in scope, I think, in my opinion. So just kind of a brief summary and a few key takeaways. There is a high need for cannabis research, and there's a need to kind of get going with it. There was a lot of anticipation and I think hope for it a few years ago, and maybe things have slowed down a little bit. Hopefully it'll pick back up again. But we do need cannabis research. And meanwhile, the regulations in Canada have undergone many changes, even in the time that I started my study. To now when we're doing data collection, the regulations have changed actually. And so my study is following the former framework, even though there are new guidelines. We still meet those, but it's interesting seeing the changes. So I actually had to catch up even for this presentation to make sure that I'm giving you the most up-to-date information. And among those kind of regulatory considerations, we have two different kind of tracks of research, with therapeutic research and non-therapeutic cannabis studies having different requirements, with the non-therapeutic studies varying by risk group of a particular research study. I also want to just point you to a few resources. So I know you maybe won't memorize these or anything like that, but if you do want the links to these resources, I'm happy to provide those. You can email me and I can send this to you. Pretty much all of these are developed, I think, by, if I recall correctly, all by Health Canada. So they have guidelines for therapeutic research, they have guidelines for non-therapeutic research. They have information on how to acquire a cannabis research license. And this was actually recently updated to follow that new therapeutic clinical trial, non-therapeutic, not clinical trial kind of scope. It was updated a few days ago. I had to email them a few weeks ago to get a hold of it, but now you can get it online, I'm pretty sure, which is great news. And they also provide some workshops. So they actually just had one on cannabis research regulations. So it's a little bit late for that. But I'm sure they will have more. So if that's something you're interested in, keep an eye out for those as well. But if you are wanting a link to any of these, I'm happy to send those to you. Yeah, and that is all I have. And so I think we're going to go to some audience corrections, but Jean, I'll pass over to you to kind of moderate that.
Thank you, Karina. That was just a fabulous presentation. And I found the regulatory history just it's so hard to keep up with everything, but that has been one of the hardest ones to keep up with. So I have we have a lot of questions that came in for you. And I'm going to start with the obvious one. You mentioned that more than any other product, it seems, the regulations are changing. And, you know, this is a product that has its own act, its own regulations, ongoing updates, and as you mentioned, guidance that's changing almost, well, not daily is an exaggeration, but
yearly.
I know. So my question is, what's your sense of, in terms of the regulatory development, what do you think is the burden of evidence that's required?
I think cannabis research, I don't know if I should see this, it's sort of maybe been an example of what not to do in terms of the constant changes, right? Maybe part of it too is just, you know, trying to keep up with being responsive to feedback, which has actually been really fantastic, right? But it would have been nice, I think, from a research kind of perspective, at least if that had been in place sooner. That being said, I know there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that doesn't always make that possible. But cannabis as it stands right now is kind of this weird in between, I think, between like alcohol research and other kind of more pharmaceutical drugs, right? So alcohol research is legal, or alcohol, first of all, is a legal substance. And research in this area, to my understanding, is fairly easy. And I think it can even be considered a low risk study. I could be mistaken, but I think I have read that. And so while cannabis, at least in non-therapeutic research, doesn't have as many requirements for pharmaceuticals, it doesn't have to be a clinical trial. First of all, it's a much more complicated system, even just that dual system of therapeutic versus non-therapeutic. But it has more regulations on alcohol, even though both are legalized and regulated in some ways very similarly, right? We have even BC liquor stores and BC cannabis stores, you know. But yeah, so it's kind of this weird in between stage, I would say. And you're right, there have been a lot of changes. And there have been a lot of guidance documents put out by the federal government before on cannabis research, before the actual Cannabis Act changed to accommodate kind of research, I guess. Yeah.
Seems like a big burden that because you said we only have 2 products out approved. So,
Right.
and
Yeah.
look how long we've had. So it's
Yeah,
interesting.
And
Yeah.
I think speaking to that point too, I think because cannabis was legalized, a lot of like non-medical per se researchers wanted to get involved with cannabis research. And then because of the regulations, they weren't able to because they didn't have those resources to be able to pull off a clinical trial, right? There's a lot of administrative work that goes into that, and personnel qualifications and whatever. So yeah, I know you last session was about psychedelics. And so I hope that Canada will be a little bit maybe more proactive with psychedelic research. And it seems like they maybe are. They have some like guidance documents coming out and stuff. So I think that maybe some lessons are being learned from cannabis research. And are
It's too bad it had to be the guinea pig, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I think it seems like they're getting better at considering invested parties' interests and doing more of a review as they make the changes. But it's the first time I've ever seen a guidance document, regulatory guidance, come out before the act or the regulations.
Yeah.
So, and then they had to quickly fix it. Okay. I have another question for you, and it's during your presentation, you briefly touched on the quality requirements. So I was wondering if you could extrapolate on that a little bit in relation to what we need to know when determining what product or supplier we'll use for interventional cannabis studies.
Yes, for sure. So I mentioned GMP and GPP. So GMP stands for good manufacturing practices, and then GPP, I believe, is good production practices. For a therapeutic study for a clinical trial with cannabis, GMP product, good manufacturing grade product, has to be used. That is a pharmaceutical standard that has to be used, a manufacturing standard that has to be used for any kind of drug that's being investigated in a clinical trial or any kind of medication that's provided to the patient population. And so this is kind of an international level standard. I remember a cannabis company in Canada was waiting for somebody to fly over from Europe for an inspection, and then with COVID happening, it wasn't possible, right? But for non-therapeutic cannabis study, now only GPP is required, which is a Canadian standard for cannabis specific manufacturing. And so I would say probably most companies are GPP, right? Because they've kind of gotten more into the recreational cannabis realm, and GMP is a bit harder to find, but they're not interchangeable standards, and GMP is, I would say, probably a higher or more rigorous, at least more documentation required, kind of heavy process.
Yeah, I bet you there's a few people taking notes on that one. Okay. Next question. Will institutions be able to have an institution-wide license for cannabis research? And I know you know the answer to this because you just looked it up.
Yes. So from my understanding, institutional license still do exist. But for any changes, I will say look at the most up-to-date document. And again, should be online now. If not, you can email to request it. But I'm pretty sure they just publish it online. So yes, institutional license still exists. But look at the new regulations, and potentially for new studies, you may want to read through that a little bit more in depth.
Have you seen it? Because when I looked last week, it wasn't up yet. Is it?
I think
Came up?
I'm pretty sure. I didn't click on every single link in there, but I think it said the website was updated like just a few days ago.
Okay, so hot off the press. You
Yeah.
got the latest. You've got the latest.
Yeah. But if not, I have the email address so that you can contact them, and I can pass that on to anybody that needs it.
Honestly, they don't make it easy. Okay. Are there IP security requirements going to relax for, are they going to relax for hospitals to be more in line with pharmaceuticals, do you think?
I don't know that I don't think there are any changes currently planned beyond the changes that have already been made on the research cannabis kind of side of regulations. So cannabis still needs to be stored, I believe, in the same way as it was before, in a locked cabinet and all that, that kind of level of security. And then I know for non-therapeutic cannabis research, you do need to report a storage plan. So again, refer to those documents, and they are looking for a fairly secure storage plan because it's still a controlled substance.
Yeah, I think it's so I used an acronym there. I meant investigational product security. So they
Okay.
treat it like for those of you that don't know, the pharmacy has to treat it like a controlled substance, like it's vaulted. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I have some audience questions for you, and I'm going to read them out, and so they're very good. Okay. When studying cannabis for treating mental health disorders, how do regulatory guidelines for studies differ from other drugs?
I'm sorry, I have to say they are no different. So there's still clinical trials. They still need to follow that the clinical trial framework and regulations, which is a good thing. But if somebody is asking that in the hopes of starting a trial, I'm sorry, but you will still have to go through all of that work.
Okay, next one. Why aren't more companies in their main industry submitting clinical trial applications? I think they're speaking to your slide on clinicaltrials.gov.
I really recommend reading that article for anybody that's curious. But I can speculate. I think to some extent, first of all, because recreational cannabis is available, that's such a bigger market, right? It's an easier market to get into. The standards are lower, and it's more lucrative, to be honest, than medical cannabis. At least, just at the current state of things, running a clinical trial requires a lot of resources. It's expensive. It takes time and things like that. And so I think a lot of companies ended up shifting kind of to the recreational market with the legalization of cannabis. And a lot of cannabis companies too are fairly small companies, but clinical trials take a lot of resources, right? So very kind of labor intensive, resource intensive. And it's also, to be honest, a little bit risky to be testing your product in a clinical trial, right? So I mentioned there's a lot of claims about potential medical uses of cannabis, and I think a lot of people are already using cannabis for kind of different, what they believe to be medical reasons. And if they're taking a substance believing that it's going to work for this, right, and then a clinical trial comes out and says that it's not effective, that is a risk, right? So I don't want to, I'm just speculating, but it's possible too that if this kind of narrative about potential effects just kind of takes its own life and doesn't have to be tested, to be honest, right, that is less risky than testing it in a clinical trial. That being said, I think testing something in a clinical trial and being able to have a medication out there to help people is really valuable, and it can be worth exploring for sure.
Yeah, and it goes back to your comment, the labeling and the burden of proof. You can't put a claim on a product if hasn't had a clinical trial.
Yes, for sure, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, another really good one. What changes to the regulations do you see as necessary to fill the evidence gap on cannabis-based therapeutics in Canada? And I'm going to add to that, is the burden of proof higher?
Right. Good question. I was thinking about this question, and because there have been kind of these changes to regulations, I don't know that at the moment. We'll see how the current regulations kind of pan out and how that affects research. I don't know that it's a regulation change necessarily that's needed, at least in the therapeutic kind of cannabis realm. I think it's a need for product and for infrastructure that meets the standards. So Canada is currently working on really developing and strengthening our clinical trial capacity. And we've seen the need for that kind of building up capacity within the country. And so I think, trying to find, I mentioned that GMP versus GPP product, right? Having that pharmaceutical grade GMP product available and having the infrastructure to be able to run clinical trials, I think is what's necessary, and maybe not fully where it needs to be at on a broad scale. So yeah, and in terms of the burden of proof, I think it depends on who you ask to some extent. So some researchers see cannabis as kind of having a lot of promise as a therapeutic for a variety of indications. And they maybe see clinical trials as maybe a little bit of a formality, not necessarily to that extent. I'm exaggerating a little bit, right? But others are also very, very skeptical, right? And so burden of proof for the general public, people are already using for what they say are medical purposes, right? So for maybe the general public, their expectation for the burden of proof isn't as high. But I think in kind of the research realm and regulatory realm, there is quite a high burden of proof because we need to be really careful with a product that is publicly available to all adults over the age of 18 or 19, depending on your province. Right. And so, yeah, from a kind of regulatory standpoint, I think there is kind of this cautious approach maybe to what is maybe approved. And like I said, we have 10 phase 3 trials and we only have 2 approved medications at the moment, right? And all of those 10 trials are even active at the moment. So yeah, I think, there's a lot of work to be done.
Yes, that's great. I wondered because that question came up with the psychedelics category as well, the bias, and is it regulatory bias?
Right. And I think too, with cannabis being illegal in the past, right, and with a lot of stigma around substance use, right, there is a lot of skepticism, which is very valid, and I think we as researchers we need to be cautious, right? But yeah,
I wonder if in moving forward for the larger phase 3s, if they might start using multi-regional clinical trials to get enough participants and sites involved to fill that evidence, right?
Yeah, for sure. Because right now, even some of those phase 3s are pretty small.
Yes,
like single site, small sample.
Noticed that. Another great question from our audience. What are the challenges to consider when starting up a clinical trial involving cannabis? That almost made me laugh out loud, that one. Challenges.
Let me tell you about my last 3. For me, initially, at the very, very beginning, as everybody, when they're starting something new, I didn't know what I was getting myself into. So initially it was just figuring out what to do and what I need to do. I didn't even know what I needed to do, at the start. So, what are the regulations and what do I need to file? What applications and permits and approvals do I need from who and how long does it take? And things like that. So a lot of it was just navigating websites and guidance documents and things like that and figuring out how all those kind of components and approvals fit together. And the other biggest thing is finding that GMP company. So I know in the US, I believe for cannabis research, therapeutic or not, the government actually is providing, at least for non-therapeutic, they are providing actually a cannabis product to researchers, or researchers purchase it from them. But in Canada, that's not the case. So finding a company to provide a cannabis product, which again, I mentioned is risky. And so I understand why sometimes companies aren't super excited about it. And they also have their own research going on that they're busy with. So yeah, that was kind of one of the challenges. But things worked out and things are underway. Yeah. And then the other thing I kind of mentioned earlier is just those shifting regulations, right? So my study is under the old framework and now it's different, right? So keeping up with those as well is something to be aware of.
Great, good answer. I'm sure if that person is that asked that wants more information, they can probably contact you. Sounded pretty targeted question, so they're probably setting it up. Oh, I like this one. You kind of touched on it, but why do all these regulations exist if it is already legalized?
Right. Yeah. So we need to, if we want to understand something from a medical standpoint, is this going to benefit a patient that has a particular health condition? We need to evaluate that systematically, right? Anecdotal evidence is not strong enough evidence for somebody to be, taking something as an anti-nauseant when they're undergoing chemotherapy, right? There is a real risk there. And so, for medical reasons, for patient safety, we do want those regulations in place because this is ultimately, even though cannabis is legalized, if it is being used in a therapeutic context, it is a medication. It's not a recreational substance. So there is people's health and safety at risk in that context.
Okay, I think that answers the next one too, which was how has legalization affected research on cannabis and medical use? Yeah, I think it's answered both. Okay. The next one is what are some resources for researchers interested in conducting cannabis research?
Yeah, for sure. So again, I'm happy to share that slide or those links that I provided. But look through, actually go through the Canadian Cannabis Act and go through their guidance documents on Division 5 from the federal government. Go through all of those. They're long. I encourage you to read through them anyway. They're very helpful. And then other resources, if you're doing a clinical trial, there is training that you have to complete. So for example, ICH Good Clinical Practice is one of them. Clinical Trials BC did a really great one last year, and that's where Jean and I met actually. And there are multiple trainings that you're going to have to do. So I really recommend going out, seeking those. There are different organizations that offer them. So look for those. And then look at CTLS, the Cannabis Tracking and Licensing System. Look at their websites, look at their guidance documents as well. Just do a lot of reading of different guidances and you'll be able to figure out eventually, I hope.
Okay, and I was just checking the question and answer line there, and there was one of the viewers wanted to know if your flow sheet is available.
Yes, and that's actually something from Health Canada. And so I can share that, but I have to give credit to them and whoever created that, and I can pass that on.
Okay, and there was one last question. It was a question on are there companies in Canada that produce GMP cannabis?
Yes, there are. Not a ton, but there are. I wouldn't recommend doing this, but I Googled cannabis companies and emailed them, cold emailed them asking if they had GMP quality product or not. But there are companies in Canada. You also can import internationally. You just have to get a particular approval for that. So in case you're curious, I can also put my email. I'll just put this in the chat if I can figure that out right now, if anybody wants me to email them anything.
Yeah. And there's complexities, not too bad, of you have to have your clinical trial approval in order to bring the product across the border. And it has to, we always tell everybody, make sure it's in the box and on the outside as well.
Yeah.
The approval. So for customs there.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, that was a lot of questions. I'm going to start moving to the wrap, and there's definitely an increased need to seek scientific evidence about the potential benefits and harms of medicinal cannabis, and clinical trials in this area starting to slowly move along. Can we safely say that? And it seems like there's a heavy burden of regulatory requirements. So I think that answers our landscape question. I think you did a great job answering our Ask Us question today. I'd like to thank our audience for all your attendance and your participation today, and you sent in just fabulous questions. We always appreciate your inspiring topics in our Dropbox. And at the end, last slide, there's a place for where you can contact us. And also, if you have more questions for Karina specifically, there's a way to contact Karina. We'd like to thank you very much, Karina, for coming today. We appreciated your time, your expertise, your insight. It's always just a pleasure meeting with you, and I love our conversations. And so I'm glad you were able to share with us today. Special thank you to our returning guest producer, Nan Doe. I see Nan there. And Nan's going to just highlight some of our upcoming events with you and provide you with some contact information.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you everyone for tuning in and staying throughout the broadcast. Just a couple of things before we close. This webinar was recorded, and the recording will be sent to you by email later today. And all of the recording of previous broadcasts will be available on our website. Also, we will send you an evaluation survey. I would really kindly ask you to kind of take 2 minutes to complete the survey. It will help us evaluate the impacts of these sections and inform our future programs like this. If you have any requests for the mentioned resources, you can feel free to email Karina or send us an email. Just a couple of upcoming events by Clinical Trials BC. As you know, we are having a symposium coming up this November 28th. If you haven't registered, we highly encourage you to do so. And for the next Ask Us broadcast, it's going to be on December 5th. The topic is going to be on phase 1 clinical trials. And then we have another series on EAT8R1, general consideration for clinical trials. Topics covered include EAT8R1 overview, QBD, CDQ, and risk management. And that's going to be in January 2024. So if you haven't connected with us, please follow us on X, or formerly Twitter, or LinkedIn, and subscribe to our newsletter. You'll get latest updates and will be informed about our upcoming events. If you have any questions, feel free to send us an email at clinicaltrialsbc@harrisbc.ca. And that was it. Thank you so much.
Great. So if you're coming to the symposium this in November the 28th, Karina will be there and you can meet Karina in person. So this was our second episode this season. As Nan mentioned, previous episodes are available and posted on the Clinical Trials BC website for viewing. We do hope to see you at the next Ask Us in December, and we're going to be learning more about phase 1 clinical trials. So mark your calendars and don't miss it. Thank you very much and have a great rest of the day, everybody.